The morning sun cast golden rays across the palace courtyard, where thousands of tourists gathered to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood a young royal guard named Thomas, perfectly still in his crimson uniform and tall bearskin hat. His face remained expressionless as tradition demanded, while cameras clicked and flashed around him. Thomas had trained for 3 years to earn this position. Every morning he would wake at dawn, polish his boots until they gleamed like mirrors, and practice standing motionless for hours. His family was incredibly proud. His mother kept a framed photograph of him in full uniform on the mantelpiece, showing it to every visitor who entered their home. The crowd that day was larger than usual. Families from all corners of the world had come to see the palace. Children pointed excitedly at the guards. Parents explained the history and importance of the ceremony, and elderly couples reminisced about their own visits decades ago. The atmosphere was filled with respect and wonder. Near the front of the barrier stood the Morrison family. James Morrison was a wealthy businessman who had brought his wife and their 12-year-old son, Bradley, on a European vacation. They had visited 5 countries in 2 weeks, staying in the most expensive hotels and eating at the finest restaurants. Bradley wore designer clothes from head to toe and carried the latest smartphone, which cost more than some people earned in a month. Throughout their trip, Bradley had been difficult. He complained about everything. The food was never good enough. The hotels were too boring. The museums made him tired. His parents tried to please him constantly, buying him whatever he wanted, hoping it would make him happy. Instead, it only made him expect more. As the Morrison family watched the ceremony, Bradley grew restless. He tapped his foot impatiently and scrolled through his phone, barely glancing at the guards. His mother pointed out interesting facts about the uniforms and tradition, but Bradley barely listened. His father suggested they take a family photo, but Bradley refused, saying it was stupid. Then Bradley noticed something. He saw how Thomas stood completely still, not moving a single muscle despite the hot sun beating down on his heavy uniform. An idea formed in Bradley's mind, an idea that would amuse him and cure his boredom. He decided to see if he could make the guard react. Bradley started small. He made funny faces at Thomas, sticking out his tongue and crossing his eyes. Thomas remained motionless, staring straight ahead. Other tourists noticed what Bradley was doing and frowned with disapproval, but nobody said anything. Bradley's parents were busy taking photos and did not see their son's behavior. Growing frustrated by the lack of response, Bradley became more aggressive. He waved his arms wildly in front of Thomas's face, trying to block his view. He made loud noises and shouted silly words. Still, Thomas did not react. His training had prepared him for such situations. Part of being a royal guard meant ignoring distractions, no matter how annoying they became. Other tourists began whispering to each other, pointing at Bradley with disapproving looks. An elderly woman tapped Bradley's mother on the shoulder, trying to alert her to what her son was doing. But Mrs. Morrison simply smiled politely and turned back to her camera. She assumed Bradley was just being playful and innocent, as she always did. Bradley's frustration grew into anger. How dare this guard ignore him? Did he not know who Bradley was? His father owned 3 companies and a yacht. They had more money than most of these people would ever see. Bradley was used to getting attention, used to people doing what he wanted. This guard's silence felt like an insult. Moving closer to the barrier, Bradley cupped his hands around his mouth and began shouting insults. He called Thomas names, mocked his uniform, and said cruel things about how stupid he looked standing there like a statue. The words echoed across the courtyard and the crowd fell silent. Cameras stopped clicking. Parents covered their children's ears. The joyful atmosphere transformed into uncomfortable tension. Thomas felt each word like a physical blow, but he could not show it. Sweat dripped down his back, not just from the heat, but from the effort of maintaining his composure. Inside his mind, emotions swirled. He thought about his family, his training, his duty. He had worked so hard to be here. This was one of the most prestigious positions a young soldier could achieve. He would not let this child ruin it. Bradley's father finally noticed the commotion. He turned around and saw his son shouting at the guard, saw the horrified faces of other tourists, felt the weight of their judgmental stares. For a moment, Mr. Morrison considered disciplining his son, pulling him away and apologizing, but he had never been good at saying no to Bradley. Instead, he chuckled nervously and said boys would be boys, as if that explained everything. The insults continued. Bradley called Thomas worthless, useless, a toy soldier playing dress-up. He said real men did not stand around like idiots in funny costumes. He laughed at Thomas's inability to respond, calling him a coward who could not even defend himself. Each word was carefully chosen to hurt, to provoke, to humiliate. Among the crowd stood someone else, someone whose presence nobody had noticed. An elderly man in a simple gray suit watched the scene unfold with increasing concern. His face was weathered with age, but his eyes were sharp and observant. He leaned on a wooden cane, standing slightly apart from the main group of tourists. Nobody recognized him, which was exactly how he preferred it. The elderly man had seen many things in his long life. He had witnessed wars and peace, triumph and tragedy, kindness and cruelty. But watching this child verbally assault a young soldier who could not defend himself stirred something deep within him. His jaw tightened, and his grip on the cane grew firmer. As Bradley prepared to shout another insult, something unexpected happened. The elderly man began walking forward slowly, his cane tapping against the cobblestones with each measured step. The crowd parted automatically, sensing something significant was about to occur. Bradley did not notice at first, too focused on his cruel game. Thomas remained at attention, unaware that his ordeal was about to take a dramatic turn. The morning that had started with such ceremony and tradition was about to become a moment nobody present would ever forget. The elderly man's cane made a distinct sound with each tap against the ancient cobblestones. Bradley finally noticed the approaching figure and turned around, ready to dismiss whoever dared interrupt his entertainment. His mouth opened to say something rude, but the words died on his lips when he looked into the old man's eyes. There was something commanding in that gaze, something that made even this spoiled child pause. The old man stopped directly in front of Bradley, looking down at him with an expression that mixed disappointment and sternness. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama about to unfold. Phones emerged from pockets, ready to record whatever happened next. The silence was so complete that people could hear the distant traffic beyond the palace walls. Bradley recovered his confidence quickly. After all, this was just some old man who probably did not matter. Bradley's father had taught him, perhaps unintentionally, that money and status meant everything. This stranger looked ordinary, someone who should step aside and mind his own business. Bradley crossed his arms and stared back defiantly, waiting for the man to speak first. The elderly man did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of authority that comes only from a lifetime of commanding respect. He asked Bradley a simple question. Did the boy understand what it meant to serve one's country? Did he comprehend the sacrifice and dedication required to stand guard, protecting traditions that had existed for centuries? Bradley rolled his eyes and laughed mockingly. He said he did not care about old traditions or stupid ceremonies. These guards were just doing an easy job, standing around doing nothing all day. Anyone could do it. There was nothing special or impressive about it. His father paid more in taxes than these guards probably earned in a year, so technically his family paid their salaries. That meant they worked for him in a way. The crowd gasped at Bradley's words. Even Mr. Morrison looked uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Mrs. Morrison had finally put down her camera and was beginning to realize something serious was happening. She moved toward her son, intending to pull him away, but the elderly man raised his hand slightly and she stopped. There was something about his presence that commanded obedience without explanation. Thomas remained at his post, still motionless, but inside he was listening to every word. Shame burned in his chest, not for himself but for this child who understood nothing about honor, duty, or respect. Thomas thought about his fellow soldiers, some who had served in difficult and dangerous places, some who had given their lives for their country. This boy reduced all that sacrifice to nothing with his careless words. The elderly man nodded slowly, as if he had expected such an answer. He told Bradley a story, speaking clearly so everyone nearby could hear. He spoke about young men and women who chose service over comfort, duty over personal gain. He described the training that turned ordinary people into guards worthy of standing before royalty. He explained that the inability to react to insults was not weakness, but the ultimate demonstration of discipline and strength. Bradley interrupted, saying it was all boring and pointless. Modern countries did not need these silly traditions. They should hire security guards with guns and cameras, not people dressed in costumes from hundreds of years ago. He said his father could buy better security for their house than whatever these guards provided. Everything could be replaced with technology anyway. The old man listened without interruption, letting Bradley finish his disrespectful speech. Then he asked another question. He wanted to know if Bradley had ever stood for anything in his life. Had he ever put someone else's needs before his own wants? Had he ever worked hard for something without expecting immediate reward? Had he ever thought about what kind of person he wanted to become? These questions hit differently. Bradley opened his mouth to respond with another sarcastic comment, but nothing came out. Nobody had ever asked him such things before. His parents asked what he wanted, what would make him happy, what he needed them to buy. Teachers asked about homework and test scores, but nobody ever asked about character, values, or who he truly was beneath the expensive clothes and gadgets. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Bradley felt dozens of eyes watching him, waiting for his response. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. It was not anger or boredom or entitlement. It was shame, small but growing, like a seed planted in unprepared soil. Mr. Morrison finally stepped forward, placing his hand on Bradley's shoulder. He apologized to the elderly man, saying they were tourists unfamiliar with local customs. They meant no disrespect. Boys sometimes acted without thinking. He would speak to his son about proper behavior. His words sounded hollow, rehearsed, the kind of apology meant to end an awkward situation rather than address the real problem. The elderly man turned his attention to Mr. Morrison. He spoke gently but firmly, explaining that the problem was not unfamiliarity with customs. The problem was raising a child who believed money and status excused cruelty. The problem was teaching a boy that he could treat others with contempt without consequences. The problem was allowing someone young and impressionable to develop into a person nobody would want to be around. Mr. Morrison's face flushed red. He was not accustomed to being lectured, especially not in public by a stranger. He started to say something defensive about how he raised his son being nobody else's business, but Mrs. Morrison grabbed his arm, shaking her head. She had seen something her husband had not. She noticed how other tourists nodded in agreement with the old man's words. She saw the disappointment on their faces, directed not just at Bradley but at both parents. The elderly man turned back to Thomas, who still stood perfectly at attention. He told the crowd that this young guard represented something precious, something increasingly rare in the modern world. He represented commitment to something larger than himself. He stood there not for money or fame, but because he believed in service, in honor, in being part of something meaningful and historic. Then the old man did something unexpected. He stepped closer to Thomas and executed a perfect military salute, holding it with the precision of someone who had performed this gesture thousands of times. The crowd murmured in surprise. This was clearly not just any elderly tourist. The way he stood, the sharpness of his salute, the authority in his bearing all suggested a military background. Thomas's eyes flickered slightly, the first break in his composure. He wanted to return the salute but could not while on ceremonial duty. Inside his chest, his heart pounded with a mixture of emotions. Gratitude, pride, validation, all fighting for space. Someone understood. Someone saw past the uniform to the meaning beneath. The old man held his salute for several seconds, then lowered his hand slowly. He turned back to Bradley and said something that would echo in the boy's mind for years to come. He told Bradley that respect was not bought with money or demanded through status. Respect was earned through character, through how one treated others, especially those who could not respond or defend themselves. A person's true nature was revealed in such moments. Bradley stood frozen, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Around him, tourists began applauding quietly, showing their support for the guard and approval of the old man's words. The sound started small but grew, spreading through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Even some of the other guards, still at attention at their posts, seemed to stand a little taller, their chests swelling with renewed pride. The applause continued, and Bradley felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. Some gazes held anger, others held pity, but most held disappointment. He had become the villain in a story playing out before strangers, and for the first time in his privileged life, money could not fix the situation or make the uncomfortable feelings disappear. Mrs. Morrison pulled Bradley close, finally seeing her son clearly for perhaps the first time. The boy she thought was confident and spirited now looked small and mean. The child she had defended countless times against teachers and coaches who complained about his behavior now stood exposed as someone who mocked and belittled others for entertainment. Tears formed in her eyes, though whether they were for her son or herself was unclear. The elderly man was not finished. He asked Bradley if he knew anything about the guard he had been insulting. Did he know the young man's name, his story, his dreams, his family, his sacrifices? Of course Bradley did not. To him, Thomas had been nothing more than a prop, an object placed there for his amusement. The guard was not a real person with real feelings, just part of the scenery. Bradley shook his head slowly, unable to meet the old man's eyes. His throat felt tight, and his chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with physical pain. This was the hurt that comes from recognizing one's own ugliness, from seeing oneself through the eyes of others and not liking the reflection. The old man began sharing Thomas's story, though how he knew these details would remain mysterious. He spoke about Thomas growing up in a small town, the youngest of 4 children. His father had been a postal worker, his mother a nurse. They had little money but rich family bonds. Thomas had joined the military at 18, sending most of his pay home to help his parents and support his sister's education. He had chosen the path of service when he could have taken easier roads. The crowd listened intently, hanging on every word. Some pulled their children closer, using this moment as an impromptu lesson in values and character. Others wiped their eyes, moved by the story of a young man who represented the best of his generation while standing before a child who represented something far less admirable. Bradley felt something crack inside him. Like ice breaking in spring, he thought about his own life, his expensive clothes and gadgets, his 3-story house with a pool, his weekly allowance that exceeded what some families spent on groceries. What had he ever sacrificed? What had he ever earned? What would people say about him if someone told his story to strangers? The old man continued, his voice carrying across the hushed courtyard. He explained that Thomas had volunteered for this ceremonial position, competing against dozens of others who wanted the honor. The selection process was rigorous, testing not just physical ability but mental strength, historical knowledge, and character. Thomas had studied for months, practiced until his feet bled, memorized every detail of protocol and tradition. This was not just a job. This was a calling. Bradley's vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall. He bit his lip hard, fighting against emotions he did not know how to process. His parents had never taught him how to handle real consequences or genuine remorse. They had always smoothed every rough edge in his life, paid to make problems disappear, excused every failure as someone else's fault. Now he stood in a situation where money meant nothing, and excuses rang hollow. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat, attempting to regain some control over the situation. He thanked the old man for the lesson and assured him they would be leaving now. They had other places to visit, and they had taken up enough time. His tone suggested the matter was closed, a situation handled and ready to move past. But the elderly man was not finished. He turned his steady gaze to Mr. Morrison and asked a pointed question. What kind of man did he want his son to become? What values was he teaching through his actions and inactions? Did he want Bradley to grow into someone people respected or someone people tolerated only because of wealth? Did he want his son to be remembered for character or merely for having expensive things? The questions landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that touched everyone present. Other parents in the crowd glanced at their own children, silently asking themselves the same questions. What messages were they sending? What examples were they setting? The moment had transcended a single spoiled child and become something larger, a reflection on modern parenting and values. Mr. Morrison's face went through a series of expressions. Anger, defensiveness, and finally something resembling understanding. He had built a successful business through hard work and intelligence. He had provided his family with every material comfort. But standing there, publicly called out by a stranger, he recognized a profound failure. He had given his son everything except guidance, discipline, and genuine values. The old man softened slightly, perhaps sensing the shift in Mr. Morrison's demeanor. He explained that children were not born knowing right from wrong. They learned through teaching, example, and yes, sometimes through consequences. Protecting children from every disappointment and difficulty did not prepare them for life. It created fragile adults who crumbled when faced with real challenges. A young woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice trembling but determined. She said her brother had served as a guard 3 years ago. He had stood in rain and snow through heat and cold, maintaining his post with pride. He had died in a vehicle accident while off duty, but his time as a guard remained one of the proudest periods of his life. Watching this child mock that service had broken her heart, the crowd murmured sympathetically. Several people moved closer to the woman, offering support and shared stories of their own military connections. The moment was building into something powerful, a collective expression of values and respect that stood in stark contrast to Bradley's earlier behavior. Bradley could not take it anymore. The weight of shame, guilt, and genuine remorse became too heavy to bear standing up. His knees buckled slightly and he grabbed his mother's arm for support. He wanted to disappear, to undo the last hour, to become invisible. But he could not. He had created this situation with his words and actions, and now he had to face the consequences. The elderly man noticed Bradley's distress. Despite the harsh lesson he was teaching, there was no cruelty in his eyes. He understood that growth often came through discomfort, that real change required breaking down before building up. He placed his hand gently on Bradley's shoulder, a gesture that somehow combined sternness with compassion. He told Bradley that every person made mistakes, especially young people still learning about the world. The important thing was not the mistake itself, but what happened afterward. Would Bradley learn and grow, or would he retreat into defensiveness and excuses? Would this moment change him, or would he remain the same person wearing different clothes? Bradley finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. He said he was sorry, and unlike his father's earlier hollow apology, this one carried the weight of genuine feeling. The words were simple, but they represented the first crack in the armor of entitlement he had worn for so long. The old man nodded slowly, accepting the apology but making clear that words alone were insufficient. He told Bradley that true apology required changed behavior. Anyone could say sorry when caught or embarrassed. The real test came in the days, weeks, and years that followed. Would Bradley remember this moment when tempted to be cruel again? Would he treat others with respect even when nobody was watching? Thomas remained at his post, still unable to move or respond, but inside his heart swelled with complex emotions. He had endured the insults without breaking, maintained his post despite humiliation, and now witnessed something unexpected. Perhaps this encounter would change a young person's path. Perhaps his silent suffering had meaning beyond the moment. Perhaps being a guard meant more than just standing watch. Perhaps it also meant teaching through example, showing strength through restraint. The elderly man studied Bradley for a long moment, as if measuring the sincerity behind those whispered words of apology. The crowd remained silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Some held their phones high, recording every second. Others simply watched, understanding they were witnessing something important, though they could not yet see where it would lead. Finally, the old man made an unexpected request. He asked Bradley if he would like to understand what Thomas experienced every day. Would he be willing to try standing at attention for just 5 minutes, completely still, while people watched and walked past? No phone to distract him, no movement allowed, no escape into conversation or complaints. Just 5 minutes of what Thomas did for hours each day. Bradley's immediate instinct was to refuse. Standing still sounded boring and uncomfortable, but something stopped him from saying no. Perhaps it was the weight of everyone's expectations. Perhaps it was the beginning of genuine curiosity about what he had been mocking. Perhaps it was the first stirring of empathy, wondering what it felt like to be in Thomas's polished boots. Mrs. Morrison started to object, saying her son did not need to prove anything to strangers. But Mr. Morrison surprised everyone, including himself, by saying Bradley should do it. His voice was firm in a way it had not been for years when dealing with his son. This was not a punishment, but an opportunity to learn something valuable through direct experience. The elderly man smiled slightly, the first break in his stern expression. He positioned Bradley a few feet away from Thomas, close enough to share the experience but far enough not to interfere with the actual guard. He instructed Bradley on proper posture, how to stand with weight distributed evenly, hands at sides, eyes forward, chin level. The instructions seemed simple, but achieving them required more focus than Bradley expected. At first, Bradley fidgeted constantly. He shifted his weight from foot to foot. His fingers twitched. His eyes wandered across the crowd, seeking his parents, looking for some sign this ordeal would end soon. 30 seconds felt like 10 minutes. The summer sun beat down on his head, making sweat form on his forehead. His legs began to ache from an unfamiliar position. The elderly man corrected Bradley's posture repeatedly, his voice patient but insistent. Shoulders back, spine straight, eyes forward. Stop looking around. Focus on a single point in the distance and hold it. Breathe steadily. Find stillness not just in body but in mind. These instructions sounded simple but proved incredibly difficult for someone whose life was constant motion and distraction. 2 minutes passed. Bradley's legs trembled slightly. His back hurt. A fly landed on his nose and every instinct screamed to brush it away, but the old man told him to ignore it. This was part of the challenge. This was what Thomas dealt with constantly, plus heavy wool uniforms, tall hats, and the knowledge that any movement could result in discipline. The crowd watched Bradley's struggle with mixed reactions. Some felt sympathy, seeing a child genuinely trying despite obvious discomfort. Others remained skeptical, viewing this as insufficient consequence for such disrespectful behavior. A few checked their watches, curious if Bradley would complete the full 5 minutes or give up early. Mrs. Morrison covered her mouth with her hand, fighting the urge to rush forward and end her son's discomfort. Maternal instinct wanted to protect him from all difficulty, but something held her back. Maybe it was the realization that her protection had created the problem in the first place. Maybe it was seeing her husband's firm expression, silently communicating that this needed to happen. Maybe it was her own recognition that Bradley needed this lesson more than he needed comfort. 3 minutes in, Bradley's determination wavered seriously. His entire body ached. Time moved like cold honey, each second stretching impossibly long. He wanted to quit, to say this was stupid and walk away, but quitting now would prove everyone right about him. It would confirm he was just a spoiled child who gave up when things got difficult. Something small but stubborn inside him refused to be that person, at least not today. The elderly man moved closer to Bradley, speaking in a low voice that only the boy could hear. He told Bradley that discomfort was temporary, but character was permanent. These 5 minutes of struggle would end, but the person Bradley chose to become would last a lifetime. Every difficult moment was an opportunity to prove something to himself. Not to the crowd, but to the face he saw in the mirror each morning. These words resonated in Bradley's mind, giving him something to focus on beyond the physical discomfort. He thought about that face in the mirror, the one he saw every day but never really examined. What did that person stand for? What did that person value? Who did that person want to become? For 12 years, these questions had never occurred to him. Now they filled his thoughts, more demanding than the ache in his legs. 4 minutes passed. Bradley's breathing remained steady, though his shirt was damp with sweat. His legs no longer trembled quite so much, having found a kind of equilibrium in stillness. His eyes stayed fixed on a distant point, a statue in the palace gardens he used as his anchor. The fly had left his nose. The crowd's murmurs faded into background noise. In the discomfort and focus, Bradley found something unexpected. A moment of clarity, of presence, of being fully in his body rather than constantly seeking distraction from it. Thomas noticed Bradley's improved form from the corner of his vision. The boy was actually doing it, actually standing properly. Something stirred in Thomas's chest, an unfamiliar feeling toward someone who had caused him such humiliation minutes earlier. It was not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the seed from which forgiveness could grow. The boy was trying, genuinely trying, and that effort meant something. The final minute approached. The old man told Bradley he was almost there, almost finished. Just a bit longer. Hold the posture. Maintain focus. Prove to himself what he was capable of achieving. The words were encouraging but firm, pushing Bradley to complete what he had started rather than offering an easy exit. When the 5 minutes finally ended, the elderly man told Bradley he could relax. Bradley's body sagged immediately, the held tension releasing all at once. His legs shook with exhaustion. His back ached, but his face showed something new, something that had not been there before. Not quite pride, but perhaps respect, for Thomas and the job that had seemed so easy from the outside. The crowd applauded, this time for Bradley. The sound was not overwhelming or enthusiastic, but genuine, acknowledging the effort rather than the person. Several tourists nodded approvingly. A few called out words of encouragement. The young woman whose brother had been a guard gave Bradley a small smile, recognizing his attempt to understand something she held dear. Bradley looked at Thomas, really looked at him for the first time. He saw not a toy or a prop, but a young man probably only 10 years older than himself, someone who had chosen a difficult path requiring discipline Bradley had never imagined. He saw the sweat on Thomas's face despite his immobile expression, the strain of maintaining perfect stillness in heavy uniform, the strength it took to endure insults without response. Words formed in Bradley's throat, halting and awkward. He told Thomas he was sorry, really sorry for the terrible things he had said. He admitted he did not understand what being a guard meant, but now he had a tiny glimpse of how difficult it was. He said Thomas was doing something important and impressive, and Bradley had been wrong to mock it. Thomas could not respond, could not even acknowledge the apology with a nod or glance. But Bradley understood now that the lack of response was not weakness or indifference. It was discipline, training, commitment to duty even when acknowledging kindness would be easier than maintaining silence. The very thing he had mocked was actually something worthy of admiration. The elderly man watched Bradley's apology with approval. The words were imperfect and stumbling, but they carried genuine feeling. Growth often looked awkward at first, like a baby bird attempting its first flight. What mattered was not grace but courage, the willingness to be vulnerable and admit wrongdoing before hundreds of strangers. Then the old man revealed something that made the entire crowd gasp. He explained that he was not simply a tourist who happened to intervene. He was a retired general who had served his country for 42 years. He had commanded thousands of soldiers, visited war zones, advised government officials, and received medals for valor. After retirement, he occasionally visited the palace in civilian clothes, wanting to see the guards without the formality that accompanied official visits. The revelation changed everything. Suddenly his authority made sense. The perfect salute, the commanding presence, the deep knowledge of military service all came into focus. People in the crowd pulled out their phones, frantically searching to identify exactly who he was. Some recognized his face from news broadcasts and history books. Whispers spread like wildfire through the courtyard. Bradley felt his stomach drop. He had been rude and dismissive to someone of enormous importance. If the general had revealed his identity earlier, Bradley would have behaved differently, not from genuine respect but from fear of consequences and recognition of status. The shame of that realization burned hot in his chest. He should treat everyone with respect regardless of their position or identity. The general seemed to read Bradley's thoughts. He said the point of remaining anonymous was precisely to see how people behaved when they thought status and power were absent. True character emerged when people believed nobody important was watching. Bradley had failed that test spectacularly, but he was being given a chance to learn from the failure. Mr. Morrison stepped forward, extending his hand to shake the general's. He apologized profusely for his son's behavior and his own inadequate parenting. His voice cracked with emotion, a successful businessman humbled before a military hero. He admitted he had focused so much on providing material wealth that he had neglected to provide moral guidance. He had given his son everything except the things that actually mattered. The general shook Mr. Morrison's hand firmly but did not let him off easily. He explained that recognizing mistakes was only the first step. The harder work came in changing patterns and being consistent with new values, in following through when convenience and old habits called for taking easier paths. Many parents had moments of clarity, but few maintained the discipline to change their approach long-term. Mrs. Morrison joined her husband and son, creating a small family circle. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at Bradley, really seeing him. She saw a child raised on praise without achievement, comfort without challenge, indulgence without consequence. She saw her own failures reflected in his attitude and behavior. The realization was painful but necessary, like setting a broken bone so it could heal properly. The general turned his attention back to Thomas, who still stood perfectly at attention. He spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, explaining that men like Thomas represented the best of their generation. They chose service when others chose comfort. They accepted discipline when others demanded freedom without responsibility. They stood for something larger than themselves when society increasingly celebrated individual desires above all else. The general's words resonated through the crowd like a bell tolling. Many people felt stirred by his speech, reminded of values they had forgotten or never properly considered. Parents squeezed their children's hands, silently promising to teach better lessons. Young adults felt challenged to examine their own paths and choices. Elderly couples nodded in recognition of truths they had learned across long lives. Someone in the crowd started clapping again, and this time the applause built into something powerful and sustained. It echoed off the palace walls, a sound of collective appreciation not just for Thomas but for all who served with honor and dedication. Other guards at their various posts stood even straighter, their chests swelling with pride at this public recognition. The general raised his hand, and the applause gradually faded. He was not finished. He had one more lesson to teach, one more moment to create. He turned to Bradley and asked if the boy would be willing to do something difficult, something that would require more courage than standing still for 5 minutes. Would he be willing to formally apologize to Thomas in a way that honored military tradition? Bradley did not understand what the general meant, but he nodded immediately. He was committed now to following through, to proving he could be better than the person he had been an hour ago. His heart raced with nervous anticipation, unsure what would be asked of him but determined not to back down. The general explained that in military tradition, showing respect to someone in uniform while they were on duty required specific protocol. Bradley would stand at attention facing Thomas, just as he had learned during his 5-minute exercise. Then he would speak his apology clearly, looking directly at the guard even though Thomas could not respond. Finally, he would execute a salute, which the general would teach him how to perform correctly. Bradley felt nervous but agreed without hesitation. The general positioned him carefully, adjusting his posture with the same patience he had shown earlier. He demonstrated the proper salute, explaining each element with precision. The hand should be flat, fingers together, thumb along the index finger. The hand should move smartly to the eyebrow, forearm at a 45-degree angle. The motion should be crisp and deliberate, not casual or sloppy. Bradley practiced the salute 3 times under the general's watchful eye. Each attempt improved slightly. His movements were not as sharp as a trained soldier's would be, but they showed effort and sincerity. The general nodded approval, saying it would suffice for the occasion. What mattered was not perfect technique but genuine respect behind the gesture. The crowd fell completely silent as Bradley took his position before Thomas. Camera phones rose higher, everyone wanting to capture this moment. The atmosphere felt charged with emotion and significance. This was no longer just about one spoiled child and one insulted guard. It had become a moment about redemption, about growth, about the possibility of change. Bradley stood as straight as he could manage, his earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of this important task. He looked directly at Thomas's face, seeing the sweat on his brow, the intensity of focus required to maintain such perfect stillness. Bradley's voice trembled as he began speaking, but he pushed through the nervousness. He said he was deeply sorry for his disrespectful words and behavior. He had been cruel and thoughtless, treating Thomas as less than human when he deserved admiration and honor. Bradley admitted he knew nothing about real discipline, sacrifice, or service. He had judged something he did not understand, mocked something he could not do himself. He promised to remember this lesson, to treat others with respect regardless of whether they could respond, and to think before speaking words meant only to hurt. The apology was not eloquent or polished, but it rang with truth. Bradley's voice cracked with emotion several times. Tears threatened to spill from his eyes, though he fought to maintain his composure just as Thomas fought to maintain his. The boy's vulnerability was apparent to everyone watching, and many in the crowd felt their own eyes growing moist. When Bradley finished speaking, he raised his hand in salute, just as the general had taught him. His form was not perfect, his hand not quite as crisp in its movement, but the gesture carried profound meaning. A child who had mocked military service now offered a symbol of respect to someone he had wronged. The transformation, however incomplete, was visible to all. Bradley held his salute for several seconds as the general had instructed. In that moment, standing before Thomas with his hand raised in respect, something fundamental shifted inside him. He felt the weight of his actions, the importance of the moment, the possibility of becoming someone different and better. This was not about performing for the crowd. This was about acknowledging truth and choosing a new direction. Thomas felt the impact of Bradley's words and gesture deep in his chest. Moisture gathered in the corners of his eyes, but his training held. He could not respond, could not accept the apology with words or movement, but he felt it nonetheless. The boy's transformation from tormentor to someone genuinely contrite touched something in Thomas's heart. Perhaps his suffering had purpose. Perhaps standing here served not just ceremony, but also teaching. The general stepped forward and placed his hand on Bradley's shoulder as the boy lowered his salute. He told Bradley he had done well, that the apology and salute showed character and courage. But he reminded Bradley that this moment was just the beginning. The real test would come in the days and years ahead, in how he treated others when nobody was watching, when there was no crowd to impress or consequence to avoid. Bradley nodded, understanding the weight of those words. He turned to his parents, who both looked at him with expressions mixing pride, sadness, and determination. They had witnessed their son's public humiliation and subsequent growth. Now they faced their own reckoning, their own need to change patterns that had created. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the changing of the guard ceremony was approaching its conclusion. Soon Thomas would be relieved of his post, able to move and speak freely after hours of perfect stillness. The general knew the protocols well and decided to wait, curious to speak with this young man who had handled such a difficult situation with remarkable grace. Bradley and his parents had moved to a bench nearby, not ready to leave but no longer at the center of attention. They sat close together, talking quietly. The conversation was different from any they had shared before. There were no demands for what to do next. No complaints about being bored, no discussion of expensive restaurants or luxury shopping. Instead, they talked about values, about the kind of people they wanted to be, about changes they needed to make. Mrs. Morrison admitted she had been afraid of disappointing Bradley, of not giving him everything he wanted. She had confused love with indulgence, believing that making him happy in the moment was the same as preparing him for life. She now understood that real love sometimes meant allowing discomfort, enforcing boundaries, teaching delayed gratification, and earned rewards. Mr. Morrison spoke about his own childhood, growing up with very little money. He had promised himself that his children would never experience the deprivation he had felt, but in his determination to provide material abundance, he had created a different kind of poverty, one of character and values. He had given his son everything except the challenges that build strength and the failures that teach resilience. Bradley listened to his parents with new ears. He was seeing them as people rather than providers, understanding for the first time that they had their own struggles and failures. The conversation was uncomfortable but necessary, like cleaning a wound before it could heal. None of them knew exactly what changes would look like, but they were committed to figuring it out together. The ceremony concluded with traditional precision. Guards marched in formation, their movements synchronized perfectly. Commands were shouted, salutes exchanged, and the new shift took their positions. Thomas was finally released from his post, able to relax after hours of rigid attention. He marched away with his fellow guards, disappearing into the palace grounds. The general knew where the guards went after their shifts, and made his way to that location. His years of military service granted him access to areas closed to regular tourists. He found Thomas in the guard room, removing his heavy uniform and changing into more comfortable clothes. The young man's face showed exhaustion, but also deep satisfaction from completing his duty. Thomas looked up in surprise when the general entered, immediately standing at attention and saluting properly. The general returned the salute and told Thomas to relax, that this was an informal visit. He introduced himself properly, though. Thomas had already guessed his identity based on rumors spreading through the palace staff like wildfire. The general praised Thomas for his conduct during the incident with Bradley. He explained that maintaining composure under such personal attacks required tremendous strength. Many experienced soldiers would have struggled with the same challenge. Thomas had represented his uniform and country with perfect honor, demonstrating exactly the kind of character the military sought to develop. Thomas thanked the general, but admitted the experience had been harder than he expected. The insults had hurt more than he wanted to acknowledge. He had questioned whether standing still and silent was really the right response, whether dignity and discipline were worth enduring such humiliation. He wondered if he was just being a target for someone's cruelty, rather than actually accomplishing anything meaningful. The general nodded with understanding. He said doubt was natural, even healthy. Soldiers who never questioned their purpose often followed orders without thinking about consequences or meaning. But Thomas should know that his response had accomplished something profound. He had taught lessons to Bradley, to the crowd, to everyone who witnessed or would hear about the incident. His silent strength spoke louder than any words could have. Thomas asked if the general really thought Bradley would change, or if this was just a momentary embarrassment that would be forgotten once the family returned to their comfortable life. He wanted to believe people could grow and improve, but he had seen enough of human nature to be skeptical. Many people said the right things in public, but reverted to old patterns once scrutiny faded. The general admitted he could not predict Bradley's future with certainty. Change was always a choice, continuously made rather than achieved in a single moment. But he had seen something genuine in the boy's apology, a crack in the armor of entitlement that might grow into something more substantial. Whether Bradley, built on this foundation or returned to old ways, would depend on his own choices and his parents' consistency. What mattered, the general said, was that Thomas had planted a seed. Some seeds sprouted immediately, others took years to grow, and some never developed at all. But gardeners still planted, teachers still taught, and soldiers still stood there, posts because the possibility of positive impact made the effort worthwhile. Thomas could never know the full consequences of his dignified response, but he should trust that ripples spread far beyond what he could see. Thomas felt comforted by these words. He had joined the military partly because he wanted his life to matter, to contribute something beyond personal gain. Standing guard had seemed like a ceremonial role without real significance, but today showed him differently. Every action taught lessons. Every response modeled behavior. Every choice demonstrated values to those watching. The general shared a story from his own career, a time early in his service when he had questioned whether his work mattered. He had been stationed at a remote outpost performing duties that seemed tedious and pointless. Years later, he met someone who had visited that outpost as a child and been inspired by the soldiers' dedication. That child had joined the military, himself eventually saving lives during a natural disaster. The general's seemingly insignificant work had contributed to a chain of events with real impact, though he had not known it at the time. Thomas listened intently, hungry for wisdom from someone who had walked the path he was just beginning. The general's story offered perspective, a reminder that significance was not always immediately visible. His role as a guard meant more than protecting buildings or maintaining traditions. He was part of a larger system that preserved values, inspired citizens, and connected present to past while building toward future. Their conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering topics from military life to personal growth to the state of modern society. The general offered guidance and encouragement, while Thomas asked thoughtful questions and shared his own observations. A bond formed between them, the kind that sometimes appears between people of different generations who recognize kindred spirits. As the general prepared to leave, he gave Thomas his contact information and encouraged the young man to stay in touch. He said he saw great potential in Thomas, the kind of character and intelligence that could lead to significant leadership positions if properly developed. Thomas thanked him profusely, honored by the attention and mentorship from someone so accomplished. Meanwhile, the Morrison family had finally left the palace grounds. They walked through the city streets without their usual destination-focused urgency. Instead, they simply wandered, talking and observing their surroundings with new attention. Bradley noticed things he had previously ignored: ordinary people doing their jobs with dedication, small acts of kindness between strangers, beauty in simple moments rather than only in expensive experiences. They passed a street musician playing violin with tremendous skill. Previously, Bradley would have dismissed such people as failures who could not get real jobs. Now he stopped to listen, genuinely appreciating the music. His father placed money in the musician's case, and Bradley watched the artist's face light up with gratitude. It was a small interaction but meaningful, a reminder that respect and kindness cost nothing but created value beyond measure. That evening, the family sat together in their hotel room rather than going to an expensive restaurant. They ordered room service and ate while discussing the day's events. Bradley admitted he felt ashamed of his behavior but also grateful for the lesson. He said he wanted to be different, but did not know exactly how to change patterns that felt automatic and comfortable. His parents shared their own commitment to change. They discussed concrete steps like reducing Bradley's allowance so he would learn the value of money, requiring him to volunteer in their community once they returned home, and spending more time together as a family doing meaningful activities rather than just consuming expensive entertainment. They talked about traveling differently in the future, focusing on learning and connection rather than just collecting experiences at luxury destinations. The conversation lasted hours, deeper and more honest than anything the family had shared in years. They laughed, cried, argued occasionally, and ultimately connected in ways that money could never purchase. The hotel room was expensive, but the real value of that evening came from vulnerability and commitment to growth. Thomas returned to his small apartment that night, exhausted but fulfilled. He sent a message to his parents,